Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us this evening. My name is Catherine Alder, and I'm from the Ainsworth UCC Peace Team and also Central Pacific Conference Palestine-Israel Network, who have both planned this series for us. This is such an important session. It's about what is happening on the ground in Palestine, Israel. And next week, we're going to be looking at what we can do. Our team never wants to leave people with how difficult this is and have nothing to do about it. So next week, we will have people from the American Friends Service Committee who will come and join us and share the apartheid-free pledge and other ideas that churches can pick up and also other organizations can pick up to do something about this. So for me, I traveled there 4 times and it touched me amazingly by being there and actually seeing it. I traveled with the Tree of Life Educational Fund, and 2 of our speakers this evening will be from there, from that organization. What I saw was that every year it was getting worse. The wall was longer. The Palestinian homes more of them were being bulldozed. More Palestinian boys were arrested without lawyers. Bigger settlements, startup attempts to build more settlements, taking Palestinian land. And just to share one incident that really stood out to me, we were at Bethlehem University with a group of students in the library, and the priest asked this one boy, could you tell the group, please, what happened to you this morning? And he looked rather shell-shocked and he said, well, my home was demolished for the 3rd time. So, how do these people remain peaceful and still go to school and hope for a better life? But they do. And they're an amazing group of people to be with. And those folks touched my heart in a way that I really wanted to help do something when I came home. So we work to plan these events to honor those that we have met on both sides of the wall, who want peace with justice, not just peace, not just calm, but peace with justice. I would like to very much introduce you to the panelists that we have this evening. 2 Tree of Life Educational Fund members who just recently traveled to Palestine, Israel. The first one is Mohammed Rashid Ali. He's a college student studying cybersecurity and programming designed to keep hackers and other breachers away from coding companies. He is a Muslim born in New Jersey and loves to travel and learn about new things centering around religion. Fascinating person. I understand he's having difficulty with his Wi-Fi, so he's going to be in and out of this particular webinar, unfortunately. But we're glad you're with us. And Fatima Ali is from Egypt, and she's a sophomore at Harvard. She learned about the occupation through articles and thought she knew a lot, and that sounds like many of us. We've watched it on TV or read. But Fatima says that the trip was completely transformative for her and her assumptions. She built a strong connection with the Palestinian people and hopes to return. That's what happened to me. So she was impressed that the Palestinians never lost hope. And she writes, despite the pain they were experiencing, they continued to treat us with kindness and hospitality. She says the Palestinians have taught me that the people that have the least are the most grateful, and I strive to embody their gratitude on a daily basis. So welcome, Fatima. That is a lovely sentiment, and I know you will do that. Omar Shaker serves as the Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. He has authored several major reports, including a 2021 report comprehensively documenting how Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against millions of Palestinians. As a result of his advocacy, Israel deported him in 2019. Sorry, I just jumped this in a way. He is a former Fulbright scholar in Syria, and Omar holds a JD from Stanford Law School. an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Affairs, and a BA in International Relations from Stanford. So with all of those impressive credentials and experience, we want to welcome all three of you to being with us. Just to tell the group, this webinar will be recorded except for the movie, and we will send out a link to the webinar and a separate link to the movie after the event. Please use the chat box for your questions. We're going to list the resources that we have about this in the chat box. So please keep your comments to a minimum in the chat box so that we can pick up questions more quickly. Beverly Pertu will be reading them and picking ones to be asked. And we won't be able to do them all, but we certainly will want to do the ones that we need to hear from right now. I will be putting some resources for you in the chat box that you can take home with you. So we're about to show the movie called Inside Israeli Apartheid, and it's by Mondawis. So can we please turn off the recording and then show the film? Just let me know. Okay, great. Okay. Wonder if we had the beginning that way. Okay, so Beverly, do you see any questions in the chat box at this point? No. Okay.
No, not yet.
All right. I'm wondering, Omar, maybe you can reflect on the movie that we've just watched and your experience and what you've been writing up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a lot, especially for those that are, new to, this issue. So, feel free to take your time to think about questions. But no, I think the video does a really good job of, sort of showing in different respects of life of Palestinians, whether it's access to land, whether it's the ability to have nationality or residence in the country where people are from, whether it's your ability to get married, how the discriminatory repressive system underlies everything. There's really no square inch of territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, where Palestinian has the same rights as Jewish Israelis. Yes, there are differences in the intensity of the repression Palestinians might face living in one part of the territory versus another, but at the end of the day, it's all inferior to the treatment of Israelis. And I think the other point, just to emphasize, I think is, while of course the video invoked South Africa, it's really important to underscore that apartheid is a legal term. International treaties, including the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, define apartheid as a universal legal term. It's also a crime against humanity set out in a convention from the 1970s, and also in one of the 11 crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. So when Human Rights Watch, when Amnesty International, when other Palestinian Israeli human rights groups call it apartheid, we're not making a historical or comparative analogy. We're making an assessment of a legal determination based on our research and documentation of the facts. And these are not determinations Human Rights Watch makes lightly. We laid it out in a 200-page report and went into great detail about how we reached that determination. So I'll just maybe stop there with those preliminary thoughts.
Okay.
Pastor Lynn put a question in the chat. She said, how might the current Israeli flap over redefining the court system affect Palestinians?
It's a really good question. I think there's a couple things to say on this, right? So, the first thing to note is that the Israeli Supreme Court has for a long time rubber stamped Israel's repression and apartheid over Palestinians. I think there's a perception in the United States that the Supreme Court has been this bastion of liberalism. But the reality is the Supreme Court has signed off on settlements. Settlements under international law are a war crime. They're a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention because they involve the transfer of one civilian population to territory acquired by war. They've signed off on punitive home demolitions. So if somebody carries out an attack on let's say on Israelis, they'll demolish the home of their families as a punitive measure. That's completely collective punishment, textbook, unlawful. It's signed off on using force, lethal force against Palestinians where they do not pose an imminent threat to life, which is the legal standard set out under international law. The Supreme Court has signed off on demolishing Palestinian homes. Just a year ago, it signed off on razing the entire Palestinian village of Musafar Yatta, which is 1,000 plus Palestinians living there, which is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. I could go on and on for another 25 minutes, but the point first to underscore is the Supreme Court has long signed off on apartheid. At the very same time, removing the Supreme Court would remove even this very limited check. There have been on occasion times where the Supreme Court, has, for example, ruled against, as they recently did, a particular demolition, or against a particular settlement. So it, has the potential, to remove that limited check. But I think the much more fundamental issue is not about the court in some ways. It's about the struggle and the mobilization within Israeli civil society. It has been unprecedented, and as a human rights activist, you inherently take hope when people take to the streets to call for pushing back against governmental repression. At the same time, though, they've rallied under the slogan of saving Israeli democracy. And I think of the words of Hagai Elad, who's a Jewish Israeli, is the head of the Israeli human rights group at B'Tselem. And he has said that democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. And if this protest movement is just about rewinding the clock 6 months, so going back to how things were 6 months ago, that's not actually dealing with the fundamental nature of the structural inequality and oppression that undergirds the system. So there's no such thing as democracy for one people and not for another people, right? Whether we're talking about the US or whether we're talking about Israel proper. So, but at the same time, there have been currents in the protest movement that have drawn the connections between the court struggle and the struggle of Palestinians. There were chants in some protests after the pogrom that settlers carried out in the Palestinian town of Hawara several months ago, chanting, "Where were you in Hawara?" So there have been some of these currents. They're not a majority trend, but I've covered Egypt for Human Rights Watch. I've covered many other parts of the world. Sometimes protest movements start as something and morph into something else. Is that likely here? Unfortunately, no. But is it possible? Could be. So that's a long answer to the question.
Does the UN have any power to assist the Palestinians?
The UN, it's a tough question, right? Because in some ways, this entire thing, the video goes back to 1948. That was a UN partition plan. That was the beginning, and we're just this week commemorating 75 years of what the Palestinians termed their Nakba, their catastrophe, which was 700,000, the majority of the Palestinian people being expelled or forced to flee their homes in the events around the creation of Israel. 400 villages destroyed. That was a UN mandate that declared that. Of course, the UN has issued many resolutions over the years reaffirming the rights of Palestinians. Those have been either vetoed by the United States or ignored by Israel. The UN certainly has the power, if that's the question, to take action against Israel's apartheid. We saw what the UN did around South Africa, where it actually mobilized the entire global system to push back against apartheid there. Now, what's the difference here? The difference is the executive arm of the UN is the Security Council, and the United States has a veto on the Security Council, which means invariably the Security Council is neutered, is unable to take action because it's subject to a US veto. And we've seen even in recent months, the United States even block the Security Council from issuing rudimentary condemnations of Israeli settlements or other abusive policies. So the UN has the power, but in the current structure, there is not the political will to do something. Now, is it possible? Yes. So to Fatema's question, I see in the chat, since it's relevant, I'll just answer it. Yes, one veto from the 5 standing members is enough to block any action. So Russia, which has used that to block action on Syria, United States vis-a-vis Israel, China, the UK, France are all able to exercise that veto. So there are many other things the UN can do. Human Rights Watch's report has a number of recommendations to the UN of actions it could take, including reconstituting some of the mechanisms that it had in place with regards to South Africa. The UN can be a powerful tool for mobilizing public opinion. There's still a majority in the General Assembly that regularly approve resolutions. They did one recently around the Nakba, around the rights of Palestinians. So yes, so the UN has the power, but not the political will, but yet it could still be a valuable tool to move things forward. But ultimately we need to mobilize, and obviously church groups and voices are critical. We've seen their voices be critical in many parts of the world. We're going to need that kind of mobilization on a massive scale to force the question.
Got another one, Beverly?
Nope. Oh, wait, here. Did the US veto power in the Security Council block action against South Africa under Reagan? Are there any lessons we can learn from the mobilization that changed US policy?
Let me actually answer the second question before the first, because I actually am not I don't know the history of the UN and South Africa, but in depth, I know in general contours, but I'm not sure if the US, I don't think so. I think the US nature, my instinct is to say no, because the US did have ties, let's be clear, with apartheid South Africa, so did other parts of the world, but I'm not sure if they rose to the level of exercising a veto, or if there was a particular vote that they would have felt the need to veto. I'm not aware of it, but doesn't mean it didn't exist. In terms of the second question, there's a lot of lessons we can learn ultimately from South Africa. The power of global civil society played a critical role. Yes, there were certain factors that played a role in it. I think, you all might know more than me, but the civil rights movement in the US and the way in which it bled into the anti-apartheid movement, but there was an incredible mobilization on college campuses, among church groups, among labor unions. Global civil society helped make the status quo more costly on the South African apartheid government. And ultimately, that was among the factors that led de Klerk, who was the last prime minister of apartheid South Africa, to seek a way to dismantle apartheid, not necessarily for principled reasons, but because that felt like the best way to safeguard the better interest of his community, of the white South African community or the Afrikaner community, in the face of significant global civil society pressure. So I think a lot of the tools we can learn from that mobilization. Now, let's be clear, there are also cautionary tales we can learn from what happened in South Africa, which is different than your question about the mobilization. But I've spent some time in South Africa. I know others have, and there's still rampant inequality. The legacy of apartheid is very much alive. Still have massive townships. Still have many structural, deep embedded structural racism, discrimination. So I think South Africa both is a story of what we can learn, especially around the mobilization, global civil society, although there were different factors, but also, I think we could also learn, hopefully when we dismantle apartheid in Israel, Palestine, we can learn the lessons of ensuring that actually changes underlying structural inequality and doesn't, not address it or even entrench it.
Catherine?
Yeah. You want me to read it out loud?
Sure, ask your question.
Okay, Omar, why, this is a congregational question, one of the members in our church. Why is it important to name Israel as an apartheid instead of just naming the issue being colonization and Zionism and going after those issues?
They're really good questions. So, I mean, first of all, let me answer this by saying, like, Human Rights Watch is a legal organization, right? Our mandate is international law. Apartheid is an international legal term, right? So it's a term that has a definition, and it also is defined under different conventions, and there are implications when you commit apartheid. So, you can be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court. There are obligations around prosecuting officials in global courts. There are implications around companies that are involved there. So that's why Human Rights Watch would write about it, because it is a legal term. Now, colonization obviously is a critically important concept. It's an historical term. Settler colonialism is an academic term. I think there's very valuable scholarship that's been done on these questions. Palestinian human rights groups have done critical work situating apartheid in the context of settler colonialism. And I encourage everybody in the congregation to read that work and to reflect on it. But we, as a human rights organization, our mandate is limited to, legal terms. And we think the legal terms matter because they have implications. And so that's why we, don't we center apartheid as opposed to colonialism, settler colonialism. In terms of Zionism, a couple of things I'd say. One is obviously it's a critically important ideology, to sort of understand, right? But what Zionism means conceptually varies, right? There are people who have different views of Zionism and what the term means. And certainly this, again, and not to diminish the importance, I think it's critical people read, and there's a long history of Palestinian scholarship on Zionism and the link between that and apartheid and discrimination and racism. But again, as a legal term, the crime of apartheid is committed. You don't need to show even a racist intent. It's intent to dominate, as the video discussed. It's about maintaining the system of domination. So from a legal terminology, that's again why the focus is there, but human rights reporting should not be the only avenue one looks at. I think it's important to consider these other doctrines, but that's why we focus on apartheid. And for us, we do it because that's what we do in 100 countries around the world, right? We document facts, we apply the law, and we reach conclusions. That's our credibility. I've personally done it in Egypt. I've done it, vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, Hamas authorities. My colleagues have documented apartheid and persecution in the treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar. We've documented crimes against humanity, including persecution in China's treatment of the Uyghurs. So our credibility is that we apply these centralized standards. Now, what Zionism and colonialism is a concept that obviously has some variance. It should be discussed, but that's our starting point.
You're muted, Catherine.
I'm trying to get that thing out of the way. There we go. Fatima, you had a comment about this?
Yeah, I just basically echoing the same thing that Mama said. Zionism and colonialism are concepts, they're not an actual system. So if you want to frame the Palestine human rights issue in terms of those concepts, yeah, it makes sense. It stems from those ideologies, but you can't just address those ideologies because they're not a physical system that you could tackle and take down. It's just a concept. So you can, Amr said, publish scholarly things about it, but you can't really take action against them because you can't just delete the concept of Zionism. Whereas if you frame it in terms of an apartheid state, you could actually take action towards taking power away from the state and establishing the rights of those people.
Okay, I wondered, Mohammed, do you want to make a comment on anything that's been going on so far that we've been talking about? Make sure we get you in. Mohammed, you hear me?
Did we lose Mohammed? Maybe
he's there, but it's okay.
Okay.
Another issue that a member at our church has raised, he's concerned that we never say that Israel has a right to exist and that the Jews have suffered great trauma. And so, of course, that they're very protective and set up the wall and all of this. So I'm just wondering what you might say to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things, right? I mean, the first thing is to say, that the abuses that are at the heart of apartheid, right? Well, whether you're talking about like from the video, right? You're denying building permits to Palestinians and you're giving them to Jewish Israelis living in settlements, right? Literally, that's a case, where, I mean, for example, between 2016 and 2018, according to Israeli government data, the Israeli government issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians and in the majority of the West Bank under its exclusive control. Meanwhile, settlements skyrocketed. Or whether it's the law that the video mentioned that denies granting long-term legal status to Palestinians from the West Bank or Gaza married to Israeli citizens or nationals. So basically, Israelis can marry people from anywhere in the world and give them the status to live with them, but not Palestinians. Or, for example, taking Palestinian land and then building a settlement on it. None of these have security logics, right? I mean, in the case of the marriage law, they technically cited security, but our report has many examples of officials saying it's really about demographics. So part of what apartheid is these are not policies that are actually justified, even in their like rhetorical justification by security. And even where security is invoked, like with the marriage example, it's really pretextual. And even where security is a legitimate concern, let's say vis-a-vis Gaza, the Israeli policy goes so far beyond what international law authorizes, right? I mean, Gaza, you have 2.1 million people who cannot leave or enter unless you fit within a narrow band of humanitarian exemptions. It's an open air prison, 25 by 7 miles. That's not allowed by international law. And no more, just the security logic no more justifies that or apartheid than it would justify torture by saying, oh, we have a security logic here under international law. Now, in terms of the issue of collective trauma of the Jewish people, it's undeniable, the Holocaust and, what's happened, historically. And I think, the report is very clear that there would be, no problem for Israel, for example, having an immigration policy that sought to safeguard a place for Jewish people, but what can't happen is to use something like that to justify the kind of mass abuse of rights of another people. Right? Whether, replace the people with any two other people. There's no justification for that. And actually, it's not even, something that is necessitated by it. And I see Fatima wants to add, so maybe I'll just say, the last thing I'll say is, again, nobody's talking about here a country's existence, right? Like, we're talking about dismantling structures of inequality and discrimination and apartheid. That doesn't mean, sending people, away. That means dismantling those structures and ensuring that human rights and justice for all are the underlying, principles that govern the system. Maybe I'll pass it to Fatima.
Yeah, so when we went to Palestine, we spoke to both Palestinian leaders, Israeli leaders, and a lot of the Israeli leaders we talked about like a 2-state versus 1-state solution. And an issue that comes up, especially with like Palestinian human rights activists, is like we don't talk about how, okay, sure, like we want to give Palestinians their land back, but what about the Jews that are already there? Because there's generations of Jewish people that have grown up and on Palestinian land and were born there. So you can't just kick them out to give the Palestinians their land back. You also have to acknowledge that they have a right to that land too as well, because that's where they grew up. But it's not really a question of whether or not Israel deserves to exist. It's more like we acknowledge that like Jews have a right to safety and to live on that land because that's where they grew up and that's the only home they've ever had. But at the same time, their right to that land should not override the Palestinian right to that land. So it's not a question of does the Israeli state deserve the right to exist, because currently the Israeli state is one that denies Palestinians the right to their state. So it's not a question of the state. It's more like, in what form does the Jewish right to that land exist? like in what form do they have that right rather than do they have that right at all, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, the right of return for refugees is a fundamental principle of international law, right? I mean, that, I mean, imagine all of you, in the United States, you have to leave because of political repression today. You don't suddenly lose the right to come back to the country you're from, because of passage of time or anything else. That's a basic human right to return to the country you're from. But that doesn't mean, erasing, as Fatima put very eloquently, that doesn't mean that, erasing the people who are there. I mean, there's been a lot of research done that much of the land that Palestinian refugees fled from is unoccupied, is there. If there are cases in which homes have been built over it, there are ways that can be dealt with and resolved. This is not the only place in the world where those kinds of issues have arisen. So there are ways to kind of deal with that. And there are many refugees that might choose not to exercise that right. Instead, they might take third country resettlement or compensation or integration in the country they're in. So I think it's worth just noting those points as well.
So Tracy's asking, has the situation for Palestinians been getting worse or staying the same in the past 10 years?
Unfortunately, it's been getting worse. And I think, that's sort of difficult to deny, right? I mean, on many fronts, right? Settlements have expanded, right? Let's start with that. Let's start with the fact that let's move beyond that and look at right now in administrative detention. So Palestinians that are being held in detention without trial or charge based on secret evidence. The number is currently over 1,000. That's a 2-decade high. We haven't seen those numbers since the early 2000s. Palestinians being killed in the West Bank. We're seeing figures that are highest since at least 2005 and in any period since the UN began systematically recording, those statistics. We see for the first time, this was mentioned at the end of the video, Palestinian human rights groups, respected groups. Al-Haq is one of them, which has been around since 1979. I mean, one of the most respected human rights groups in the entire Arab world, who have been outlawed by the Israeli government. They've been labeled terrorist organizations. They've been ordered shut down. Look at the situation in Gaza, right? Where, 10 years ago, we were a few years into Israel's closure blockade policy, but now we're 16 years into it, and the situation has gotten worse. Gaza is in a situation of active de-development. 80% of the population relies on humanitarian aid. The majority of families have no electricity for the majority of the day. And this is not, this is a very developed, educated population. This is not, a population that's, is used to those kinds of conditions. So I could go through many other metrics: home demolition numbers, settler violence, impunity. We have a government that's maybe as extreme as we've ever seen on the Israeli side. So unfortunately, the situation on the ground is in many ways unprecedentedly bad.
I was wondering if Mohammed might like to comment on what he saw there that matches apartheid or anything else that you'd like to share with us.
Sorry, I had an issue where I couldn't really see most of it. I was only there for like the first couple of maybe 2 minutes or so.
Of the movie.
Yeah.
Can you comment on what you saw when you went to Palestine, Israel, and how does it match apartheid from what you saw? Or not?
Where would I even start? Let's see. Well, I mean, we can talk about I think it was, sorry, I forget the name of the city.
Hebron. Hebron?
Yeah, Hebron. So when we went to Hebron, we were trying to get a commentary from one of the people that was there. He was also Jewish, and he was more on the Israeli side, because although he had seen everything for himself, there was many different soldiers that would come through, and they would give us these weird looks, but when they would see that this man was with us, they wouldn't really say anything. But so
We lost him again. I wonder if that was a breaking the silence soldier. It might have been. Was that, let's see. Fatima, was that a breaking the silence soldier that was with you?
So I can like pick up where he left off and add
Okay.
some things.
All right.
Oh, this sounds good. Can you hear me? Oh,
Yes,
okay.
if you just kind of lean into your computer and not bounce around, it works better.
Yes, sorry. Okay, I just want to speak more generally about apartheid. So basically all of this is what the soldier told us actually, is that all of the occupied Palestinian territory is split into 3 different areas. So there's areas A, B, and C. Areas A is like completely or mostly under like Palestinian Authority, like they control those areas. Areas B is like a mix of Palestinian and Israeli authority, and then area C is which most of it is like completely Israeli authority over like social rule and military rule. So right now 60% of the occupied territories are under the area C category, and that like percentage has grown over the years, and also the population is more dense in area C, because what the Israeli government does is that in areas A and B, and this is like we met with Palestinian families and they told us this personally, like they don't make enough money there. Like for example, an Israeli teacher like in Tel Aviv could make 10 times the salary of a Palestinian teacher in an area B or A area, so they don't make enough money to live, so they're forced to move to area C, which is completely under Israeli rule, in order to make enough money to support their families. And that way the Israeli government is forcing them to go under their control just to make a living, and that's how they're continuing the occupation. And same with resources too. Resources in A and B are a lot more limited, even though it's under more Palestinian authority than it is Israeli, but that's one of the tactics they use to get more Palestinians under Area C control. And that's why like international acknowledgement of the issue is important, because the more people about it, the slower that process is, because right now it's accelerating.
Okay. Beverly, anything more in the chat?
Nope.
Okay. Omar, do you have some more? Thank you, Fatima. Do you have some more comments that you'd like to make?
Happy to go wherever the conversation is. I mean, I think an important point to keep in mind, right, is like I think the discourse that exists in the United States is so disconnected from some of these realities on the ground that it can be a bit jarring to kind of hear all this. But I think it's important to sort of underscore, some basic things, right? Like if you don't take anything else away from the video, right, that like a 56-year occupation is not a temporary thing, right? This has, been around for 2/3 of the life of the Israeli state. A system that basically exists to methodically privilege one people over another, right? We're talking about a daily reality of structural violence and repression, is not a conflict between 2 equal parties. Denying millions of people their fundamental rights solely because they're Palestinian and not Jewish is not just a matter of like an occupation that's abusive. I think underscoring those kind of realities is really important. And I think it's also important for us to understand that the peace process narrative has sort of become a fig leaf, right? There is no peace process today. The Israeli government has said that. Everybody knows that. It's basically become the kind of thing somebody says to escape having to deal with the reality of apartheid, right? And this hiding behind discussion of possible solutions. The more people talk about solutions, the less they talk about the problem that necessitates a solution. And so I think it's important when people, if you're in discussions or people want to talk about solutions, just take a step back here and say, right, whatever solution you might believe in, today we have one state in effect that's one government that rules the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, where 2 groups of roughly equal size live, and where the policy systematically is to privilege one and repress the others. And so whatever you might believe is the way forward, step one has to be recognizing that reality for what it is, right? Like, let me just not even speak as a lawyer, right? As you know, what's the first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly, right? Like, you have the wrong diagnosis, it leads to the wrong conclusion, the wrong analysis, and so the wrong recommendation. So we have to diagnose it correctly. Apartheid, let's remember, like in the 1970s, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin warned about the possibility of apartheid. In 2006, Jimmy Carter wrote a book, Peace, Not Apartheid. In 2014, John Kerry said we might, apartheid's a year or two away. So, apartheid may have not even been a hypothetical or a theoretical or a future solution then. It's certainly not today. It's the lived reality for Palestinians.
Got those, Beverly? Couple of questions there.
Well, they're mostly comments.
Well, where can we find the Human Rights Watch report on Palestinians in Israel? Is that what you put in the chat earlier, Omar?
Yeah, it's at the top of the chat.
Okay.
For the top of the chat, there's a lot of different things, including that. I tried to copy it, but my copying skills weren't too good.
It's all right. So here's a comment by Fatima, something I forgot to add. In order to make a living, a lot of Palestinians are actually forced to go to Tel Aviv and build the very settlements that are taking over the land.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it sounds like slavery. Build the White House, right? There's another comment that most of the media groups leading with news on Israeli casualties when Palestinian casualties are much higher.
Leslie, did you scroll to the very top?
I'm scrolling. Yeah, at the top of the chat, we put in a whole bunch of resources that I hope will help folks find some answers. Omar, we're not going to stay on much longer, so I just wanted to. This is something that's bugged me since I was there. Palestinians aren't given mortgages, so they have to come up with the money to build their house. Then they're not given the right, a license to build a house, but they have a family, and the family expands. So the grandfather's on the first floor, the father's on the second floor, the son's on the third floor, and then along comes Israel and demolishes the home. I mean, it's just insane to me. The way this is happening with people who are residents of Israel or residents of Palestine. And I don't know how that works in Gaza, if it's the same kind of problem in terms of licensing or building a home, if it's the same layered kind of situation. Do you know?
It's different because Israel withdrew its settler population and ground forces in 2005. So that dynamic is different in Gaza, right? Gaza, the problem you have is one of the most densely populated areas on earth. So you have 2.1 million Palestinians living in a 25 by 7 mile strip of land, right? Many of whom, by the way, are refugees from 1948, so who live in refugee camps, within Gaza. So the problem there is it's not the same dynamic, of demolitions and but it's just a problem of space, land, and income. 80% of families rely on humanitarian aid. There have been these successive every year campaigns of bombardment that have destroyed scores, hundreds of Palestinian homes, high-rise buildings that have hundreds of homes and businesses there. If you want to think about Gaza on the way in the West Bank kind of way, El Mizan, the Palestinian human rights group, wrote a report called the Gaza Bantustan. And basically it argues the way to see Gaza is like a big Bantustan, not so different than like in the West Bank, the Palestinian cities. because in some ways Israel treats them now as territorial islands. They build settlements and everything around them, but they don't govern inside Area A. In the dense cities. They're not controlling the permitting there. They just squeeze people in. They take all the land around, and so you're squeezed into this enclave or Bantustan. And in essence, that's what Gaza is. It's just, you know, isolated and you know, but that's the same concept. I mean, to use that more simple terminology, the Israeli policy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea can be best understood as maximum land, minimum Palestinians.
Lynn,
Yeah, if you put some resources in early on in the chat, people that joined after that cannot see it because I see nothing in it. So Omar put one link in that we can see, but Bev or Catherine, you need to redo it.
Dave did it for me. Dave, are you able to copy that and put it down below? Tricky little trick right there.
Yes, I can do that, I think.
Okay, thank you. Omar and Mohammed and Fatima, where's the hope? You know, you hear this, you watch this. Where's the hope? You get to go first, Omar, if you want to.
Sure. I mean, I take a lot of,
Island.
you know, I'm an optimist. I think you have to be to do this kind of work, but I take actually a lot of hope in the fact that human rights defenders on the ground, the Israeli-Palestinian International, there's this consensus that's developing a very clear-eyed assessment of the realities on the ground. There's very much visionary leadership on the ground of human rights organizations, civil society groups, and never before have I seen a situation where the assessments of groups with very different mandates and backgrounds have been so similar. And that there's a consensus in the human rights movement on apartheid. It's not just Human Rights Watch or Amnesty saying it. We now have Palestinian groups have been saying it for a while, obviously, but you know, 27 Israeli human rights groups use the term apartheid to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic came to the same conclusion. Several major UN experts have done the same. You know, it's not just human rights groups. You know, you have the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. You have prominent academics like Lawrence Tribe. You have commentators on MSNBC. I'm giving US references, but there are corollaries in other parts of the world as well. Even in Israel, you have the former Deputy Attorney General, the former Attorney General, the former Director General of the Foreign Ministry, members of the Knesset, 120 Israeli law professors. And now you actually have governments, South Africa and Namibia, Indonesia, Malaysia, the entire African and Arab bloc at the UN Human Rights Council, the entire Organization of Islamic Conference, all have used the term apartheid to describe the treatment of Palestinians, as have the foreign ministers of France, Luxembourg. I could go on for a while, but the point is the paradigm has started shifting. Look at polling data in the US, look at the conversations you're having today. I mean, probably you weren't having this conversation a decade ago about apartheid in Israel-Palestine. Maybe you were, maybe you're ahead of the curve, but most weren't. So I guess the point of the story is that the paradigm is shifting. That's significant. It's hugely significant. It has not yet changed the reality on the ground. And it's not yet penetrated the halls of power in the United States. You know, it's not even in the mainstream part of the Democratic Party. So we've done something. We have a ways to go, but I get hope in that. And because ultimately I believe, you know, that if the world recognizes, and it's recognizing it's apartheid, that'll trigger action to end it. So that's our challenge, is to continue to build the shift in viewpoints and then translate that into concrete action.
Dave, can you please add the film link to the chat so people can go to that?
I'll try
Thank you.
to find it first.
It was a little choppy, and no fault of yours. It just, for some reason, it was choppy way more than usual. Okay,
I think it's an issue that we would like. Sorry, there's two of us here.
Nan,
Yeah.
if one of you could mute your device, device, you can probably talk. Oh, now you're muted, Nan. We
you're muted,
can't-
not Dick.
No, Dick's muted too, so.
Oh, one of you has to unmute. Nan wants to talk, it should be Nan that unmutes, obviously.
If he wasn't muted, then we shouldn't.
Yeah, it shouldn't be echoing, sorry.
It's weird. Shall we wait a minute and try somebody else and then come back, or you want to try to fix that, Nan? It has to just be one of you. Want to make sure Muhammad gets a chance to say something here. That poor thing, your connection's been terrible for you. Muhammad, do you want to have a reflection before we, whoop? I just saw you jump around there. Anything that you want to say before we go? Very hard to get a connection for him. Nan, do you think you have it fixed? Can't hear you, Nan.
Move on.
I said a statement in the chat.
Oh. I'm trying to move that over. We will send that out in an email. Gladly do that. Send the links out. Okay, any final thoughts? Or shall we call it a night? And I want to be sure to encourage people to come next week, because next week we'll be talking with two people from the Friends. Yeah, I'm going to lose my train of thought here, but the Friends Service Committee, and they're the ones who are leading the apartheid-free pledge through the country. Hopefully, help us understand some ways that we can help to move that in our own churches, and other actions that we can take. I know that the Peace Committee from Ainsworth wants to come up with a template letter that would be a letter template that would be used to send to representatives about Israel being an apartheid and that we should not be funding that. Okay.
Fatima has her hand up.
Thank you. Fatima?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know everyone wants to leave. I just wanted to add a few things we saw there that I think is really important. In terms of action moving forward, I think it's important to also acknowledge that we need Israeli aid when taking action, like when making change, because even if like externally we have people that are like motivated to make change and we have organizations that are coming together, you also have to have connections on the Israeli side that are willing to convince their government and their leaders to also take action, because it's not a one-sided issue. Like, both parties are involved and you have to convince the other side to work with you. And we saw like it was very like small, the amount of support we saw when we went there, but just a very short story. There were two girls we met, young women like 24 years old, that served in the IDF. But they were aware of the occupation, and serving in the IDF is mandatory, so they didn't have a choice, but their role was not like a military role. They actually worked in a school. And it was like a very small show of resistance that they did, but I think it was really powerful. Basically what the girls did is that they played a song for the kids that they were teaching while they were on duty, and it had something about it about the occupation, because they wanted to teach Israeli kids that the occupation existed and this was the reality that they were living in. But they got caught by the principal of the school and almost got in trouble for it. So then they told us that they tried to find more subtle ways of bringing it into the kids' curriculum. I think that's really powerful because there are people on the Israeli side that recognize that this is an occupation and apartheid, and there needs to be something done about it. And if you work with people on the Israeli side that recognize that, you're able to make more change. Another girl we met with told us, I forgot the name of the organization she was in, but they're based in Sheikh Jarrah, and basically every month Jewish people and Palestinians go out and march. Like they block off all the streets and march against the demolition of people's homes in Sheikh Jarrah. And the IDF can't do anything about it because there are Jewish people with them. The IDF does not hurt Jewish people. If it was just Palestinians protesting, they would have been like hurt immediately. But because there's Jewish people with them, it offered them some protection, and they were able to get the word out without getting a lot of people hurt. So I think that's a big lesson to take away from it.
Thank you for that. I think that at this point, we need to thank our panelists for coming and for all the people who have, yes, and all the people who have joined us this evening. And please do come for next week. And the chat box will be available, I guess, with the video, correct, Dave? We'll be able to do something with the chat box to share it as well, or the resources at least. You're muted, hun.
Resources, yes, I'm not yet sure about copying the chat.
I think probably just the resources. That's all we really need to do. And we'll make sure they're available when we send out information about this webinar. So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Catherine and Beverly and Dave.
Dave
Thank you
and
so
Dave.
much for your work.
That was nice, Lynn. Thank you. And
Thank
Omar,
you.
I'm glad I got your name right finally. And
And
Mohammed.
thank you to our visitors. We really
Yes.
appreciate it.
And I know you're up late over there, so that's much appreciated. So good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.